Welcome to part two of this history of Christianity and science. Part one, of course, was Christians when they rejected science. Now, this part two is going to be about Christianity when the Christians decided that they would embrace science. Now, how did Christianity get their science? This where did we get it? Well, really easy. We got it from the Arabs. Um, our term algebra is of course, development of mathematics. That's an Arabic term. We still use the Arabic numerals in our numbering system, so that betrays the fact that we Christians owe our beginnings of science to what we got from the Arabs, and of course that also include the Arabs were developing science past what the Hellenistic era. That they made some developments in astronomy and geometry. They would use maybe some of the knowledge to lay out a mosque and the time the prayers and the 5 times a day. But now, how did the West get it? We've been talking about the West, who did translate these writings of Aristotle. The only thing the West had of Aristotle was a little bit on rhetoric. It was part of, I think, what they call the trivium that people in learning literacy, but they didn't. None of these scientific writings were translated. Well, Aristotle writings were actually preserved in the East by the Nestorian Christians. They were the Christians that lived in Syria and maybe in Babylon, outside the Roman Empire. But they're not Greek speaking. They are Aramaic speaking. And these writings of Aristotle that are in Greek are being translated into the Syrian language or Aramaic language. And when Islam or the Arabs conquered the East or these Syrian areas, the Christians translated them into Arabic because Arabic is now becoming the language of government, the language of learning, and the Islamic scholars became leaders in the science. The Christians, they discovered these writings as a result of the Crusades. The people in the Crusades, they found these, they sent them back, and some of these writings of Aristotle were the Jews, Moses Maimonides, most influential Jewish rabbi in the living in the Islamic areas. You call these Sephardic Jews. He adapts Aristotle for use by the Jews. But they also were being brought into the faculties of the arts in the Christian universities, not the faculties of theology in the beginning, but where they wanted the works on astronomy and medicine and that type of thing. And so Christians were becoming familiar with them, and it was becoming controversial because, of course, Aristotle wasn't suitable. But Maimonides, he's making Aristotle, trying to modifying Aristotle for the Jews could use them. So following that method, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, he modifies the teachings of Aristotle to try to make them useful for Christians to use. Now, the importance here is it's not pure Aristotle. Aristotle is basically Neoplatonism is the official theology of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. This is about the emergence world, philosophical world. But if you change this emerging world from a hierarchy, ideal hierarchy from Plato to Aristotle, everything is now a visible world. You're talking about things that you can see, and this was in a way much more compatible than the Augustine kind of Neoplatonism, because the Bible, the God of the Bible, he when he created the world, he pronounced it good. So you now don't have to demon. You can actually bring science in. You don't have to demonize the visible world. So science could develop as a result of what Aquinas did. But there was also this tendency to rationalism. Here is Maimonides teaching rationalism can be used to replace faith. Well, explain religion in in terms of science or this world explanation of religion. I think that's the best understanding of what we might call rationalism. Uh, it's not it uses reason, but it uses reason in a different world. Now, this was attractive to the miracles. You can't rationally explain miracles. You just have to accept them. But the rabbis did know miracles, and I learned from the Jewish teacher, famous Jewish scholar Michael Stone. He was teaching about early Judaism in the Roman world, and he said the pagans thought when they heard about a Jew, they thought about a sorcerer. Jews and sorcerer meant the same thing to them. In fact, you see this in the New Testament. You see these Jewish sorcerers opposing the apostles, but in fact the rabbis they accused Jesus of being a sorcerer, and now of course the Christians they banished Aristotle because sorcery is not something that Christians would accept, but the and the same thing. But anyway, it was more open to science or a rationalist view. When you take miracles out, now you can explain the world in a rational way. Same thing, Muhammad didn't know miracles. Now, I'm not saying that this was not controversial. Both there were Jews who opposed Maimonides' rationalizations, and there were Muslims who opposed this science that the Arabs were bringing or teaching the world as being uncreated and things that didn't seem to be compatible either with the Bible or the Koran. And then at the same time, we can also with the sacraments and that to kind of reduce the spiritual power which we associate with miracles or the casting out of demons. They can in fact a lot of the sorcerers would use the name of Jesus to drive the demons out of a place. They weren't Christians, and in fact Jesus made mention of some of those using his name. He said, leave them alone, you cannot do that. So but the there if you make the spiritual powers into something that the human can do by saying the right things, that's into sacraments, that can turn into a rationalist explanation of Christianity, which is kind of what Thomas Aquinas did. So he made the sacraments part of he turned Christianity into sacrament owing these sacraments. So science is now introduced into Christianity. Thomas Aquinas says, no, we still need the Bible for things that we could not know without divine revelation. But he introduced science as a separate and a complementary source of knowledge. And that's the way probably maybe many Christians or most Christians may see science as having its realm and faith as having its realm, and they being complementary. But there are also potential for the conflicts. When you bring science in, science talks about some of the same things that the Bible talks about. So there can be conflicts. But Aristotle is also not only used to talk about the things that are not in the Bible, but actually interpreting the Bible and Christianity. And Aquinas really interpreted Christianity in terms of Aristotle. This interpretation is famously depicted in Dante, the poet, his Inferno, the world that Dante describes essentially the world that Thomas Aquinas developed or gave forth. It's a feudal order. Now, it's not the order of Christianity as taught by the apostles, but it was the order of pagan Rome, which was to a great extent at this time. You had this order. You had the serfs, you had the knights, you had it's a hierarchical order, and this is the way that in the feudal era, we call it or medieval era, the Christians were also Christianity was also using this order. It didn't come from the Bible; it came from pagan Rome, but it was part of Christianity. Now, a, one of the medieval scholars that came right after Aquinas said, "Look, you're limiting God's freedom," and that's true. By saying that God's ideas, you're not allowing God to do miracles or to have a freedom. So Scotus became, and Scotus, though, these in the medieval era, they were excellent at logic and reasoning. In fact, Charles S. Peirce, who's probably the most admired teacher of philosophy, he was an American philosopher in history. He said that that logic at this time reached its high point under Scotus. But Scotus, he was more. A lot of these ones that are championing the Bible over Aristotle are coming from Britain, as Scotus coming from Scotland, as his name is. But so did William of Ockham. They may be teaching in Paris because Christianity at this time is a European thing in the West. But Occam says these universals are not, the particular comes first. They exist, and that was the modern, what we call the modern way of looking at it. This is a term, the via moderna, where but the Scotus, what the Occamites are saying, God's wisdom in creation was too great for the human mind. And therefore you have to actually study his creation. So you see empiricism coming from these who are opposing Aristotle, and the teachers of Aristotle are opposing those who, they're trying to bring in the ideas and the philosophy basically to rule science, and now Scotus's disciples, though Scotus is opposing Aquinas, Scotus' disciples still in the notion that the ancient way, the via antiqua, is superior to Occam's modern way. So you had this big debate between the disciples of William of Ockham and the disciples of Scotus, and in fact, there's a story about in the medieval times the scholars were debating about how many teeth does a mule have. And apparently one of the church fathers had said one thing, and Aristotle had said both things, and both of them were ancient authorities who were admired, people that were in the books. One of the students that was a new student there, he said, "Well, there's a mule outside. Why don't we just go outside and count the teeth of the mule?" And the students, they all turned on him and called him a fool, because learning was coming from the books, from the Via Antiqua, rather than from the hands, from the going out and observing things. But Occam's disciples actually, by observing things and they actually developed some of the principles of impetus, which became used in mechanical science even before Galileo and Newton. Now, the reformers will now, very soon, they will be rejecting Aristotle with their principles of sola scriptura and the priesthood of believers. So the Reformation was to a great extent simply a rejection of Aristotle, but the Council of Trent, what's Protestants call the Counter-Reformation, or what Catholics call the Catholic Reformation, they then actually made Thomas Aquinas' view, philosophy, the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, just wanted to show you this this little picture here. These are the hats worn by the disciples of Duns Scotus. So they were called dunce hats. And of course, later on, the dunce was sent to the corner of the room and given one of these hats. And this, it was the humanists, they would later call these medieval Catholics dunces, but they were actually the brightest people, brightest thinkers in of all time were among these that wore these dunce cap. Now, Aristotle's science is now coming in. We're understanding the Bible according to Aristotle's science, which includes this earth-centered universe. Aristotle's way of teaching things went to their natural place. The light things went up and heavy things went down. And of course, when things went around, you needed something to push it according to Aristotle's science. So they added the Bible to that and had angels pushing the stars and the planets around the sky. Because Aristotle, of course, is teaching that different laws govern different natural places in the universe. And of course, Isaac Newton is going to later challenge that. Now, here we see Dante's, Aquinas' view of the world and Dante's Inferno. You got heaven above, and you got hell in the middle of the earth. Kind of a physical explanation of heaven and hell, because it's scientific. But one of the big changes, though, is the fact that while the biblical world is historical, this puts a scientific view and it kind of eliminates history, or history kind of turns into space. And this is going to influence later teachers of the Enlightenment when you travel to the lands of the Bible. It's like you're traveling back in time. And that had a big impact on the development of modern racism during the time of the Enlightenment. We'll cover that in a later film. Now, here in the Renaissance, history was rediscovered, but not by science, by scholars. They realized that some writings were, by the kind of Latin language in medieval time was not the same as the Latin language in time of ancient Rome, Cicero. And so they realized that you had current modern writings that they were it was all Latin then, but it was modern Latin. You had medieval Latin and you had ancient Latin. So there was a sense of history that was brought in not by science but by scholars. And then it would be some time before science would get a historical understanding, and that would also be used from the Bible. So this is basically carries us to the end of how, well, at least it tells us how Christians came to accept science.